Welcome to the Louder Than Silence podcast with your host, C.G. Wagner. This podcast is an extension of our work at LTS to support survivors of sexual violence with long-term care, community, and resources, all at no cost to participants. This month's episode is Boundaries Part 2. I will never forget sitting in my therapist's office one day, going on and on about how something someone else did to me hurt my feelings and made me angry. It felt good to vent about how wronged I was. And then my therapist very bluntly asked, "Do you understand that you did this to yourself?" I was shocked and a little angry. In no world did I think I had a hand in how this other person had treated me. From my perspective, all of the blame lay on their shoulders, and I was the recipient of their poor treatment. It baffled me that my therapist could point to me as having done this to myself. She said, "Next time you find yourself getting particularly upset about what has happened to you, remember that when we get the most angry, it's because we have violated our own boundaries in some way." My therapist told me this almost 7 years ago at this point, and it's still something I regularly think about. I have yet to find an instance where this has come to mind that it wasn't applicable. Every single time, it's proven to be true. And boundaries are all the rage these days. People love talking about their boundaries, setting boundaries, who has crossed their boundaries, you name it. But can you actually explain what a boundary is? Most people can't. It's funny, isn't it? It's something that many of us hear about repeatedly, just going through our days, talking to coworkers, texting with a friend, watching a show. But yet few of us have a solid idea of what it actually means and how to incorporate them into our lives. We're in the middle of our Survivors Have Paid Enough series, and right now we're talking about relational health. This is episode 10 of the series, where we are exploring 8 different areas of health and dive into how survivors of sexual violence have all areas of their lives impacted by the trauma they've experienced. We also learn about ways to improve these areas of health and see the life transformations we want. We started the series by exploring how mental health is affected by sexual violence and taking a deep dive into PTSD. We then began unpacking emotional health and what it looks like to feel big emotions and practice good emotional hygiene. Recently, we started a conversation about relationship health and how to identify safe relationships. For this episode, we are continuing our exploration of relationship health, specifically setting boundaries and identifying some things that get in the way of connecting well with others. Last month, we started talking about boundaries, and by popular demand, we decided to expand on that topic a bit more this month. Putting it very simply, boundaries are an expression of what we want and need to be healthy. They change with time in recognition of where we are as people and what is happening in our lives. It is seeing what gets in the way of our vitality, our peace, our well-being, and putting safeguards in place so that those things can't get in the way anymore. That's it. Boundaries are never about trying to change someone else or get them to do what we want them to do. That's manipulation and control. But we often view these situations with the notion that if only the other person was different or better or something, then we wouldn't have the issues we're having. What happens is that we ignore ourselves, ignore our intuition, ignore the boundaries we've set, and make decisions that go against what bring us to a place of a full, vibrant life. We put ourselves in situations where it isn't possible to get what we want or what we need. And then we get angry at the other person. We frame it as them having done something wrong instead of being willing to assess our own behavior. Want a few examples? You get angry at your boss when you're the one choosing to respond to emails at 10 p.m. You're frustrated with your partner because you didn't communicate that them not doing their designated household chore makes things harder for you. You're irritated with your parents about the snacks they feed your children, but you've never told them what kind of snacks are allowed. Or you did tell your parents what kind of snacks are allowed, but then you never followed up with them when you found out they weren't honoring your wishes. You stopped talking to your friend for a few weeks because they convinced you to get dessert when you went out to dinner, knowing that you were eliminating sugar from your diet, but you never chatted with them about it. You get the point. When we don't make decisions that align with our values or communicate them to the people who need that information, we are setting ourselves up for a situation in which we feel hurt, let down, or angry. So it's up to us to ensure that we are prioritizing our values, the things we want and need in our lives. No one will or can do that for us. The challenging part of learning how to set boundaries is that we need them in the areas we need them the most in the areas that we feel the least comfortable addressing. The best way to figure out where to start with boundary setting is to see what part of your relationships feel the most unmanageable to you. Make a list if you need to. And doing this process with the help of a therapist, especially an EMDR therapist, helps tremendously. Can't encourage it enough. But as you look at this list, you know what areas feel easy to you and what feel like a challenge. Find an area that feels the least in your control and then begin this process of setting boundaries. This is what it looks like to learn that only you are in charge of your life. Once you recognize what you want to work on, make a list of all the boundaries you would like to put in place. Some of them will be with yourself, some will be with others. After you make your list, pick the easiest one and start there. Once that's the new normal, add another, and then the next. But it always has to be the next easiest thing. If you choose a challenging or complicated one to start with, it's much less likely that you'll stick to your new boundary. And after selecting the easiest one, make a list of all the people in your life that this may affect. Then decide if you need to explicitly or implicitly tell them about this boundary. Now, some boundaries are sweeping. For example, I never respond to a text after 10 p.m. Or it's per group. For example, I don't respond to texts from friends during the workday. Or per individual. Like, I only do phone calls and not texts with this one person. So, for instance, if you are going to leave the house 5 minutes earlier for every meeting you go to, that will potentially impact your boss, your coworkers, your partner, your children. You decide that you need to tell your boss and your partner explicitly because you have shared schedules with them that overlap. But for your coworkers and children, they only need to be told implicitly through your new actions. This is just an example. But prepare for some pushback when you explicitly communicate your new boundaries. The systems that were in place worked on some level for the other person, even if the new way will benefit everyone. Change is difficult to deal with, even when we decide that change for ourselves. Change is even more challenging to deal with when someone else decided to make a change that impacts us. People have all sorts of weird ways of navigating how someone else's boundaries impacts their lives. Remember, it's not on you to manage their emotions, but you can certainly work through the friction that arises from your decisions. And the bigger the decision and the longer the old pattern has been in place, the more emotional connection there is in that area and with that person, and the stronger the pushback will be. Their patterns will want to push you back into line because the old way is what their brains are telling them is safe. You get to learn how to stick with your boundaries in the face of this. If you're not sure what I mean, let's use laundry as an example. If you live with a roommate, you don't do their laundry, period. It's just not done. If you and your partner have just moved in together a month ago and you tell them that you want each of you to be responsible for your own laundry, it's not a huge deal. It's all part of navigating building a life together. But if you've been married for 50 years and doing that other person's laundry the whole time, and you tell them one day that you're no longer doing it, well, let's just say that you should be prepared for some serious pushback to that one. It doesn't mean that it's wrong or bad. It's just different than how it's been. That's all to say you should have some plan in place for when the other person tests your new boundaries. How do you talk to them about it? What are the consequences of them testing it? You can't control their behavior, only yours. So you are figuring out how you respond to it, not how to get them to change. And part of what you are figuring out is also how to regulate your emotional response to their behavior. You're already doing something difficult by setting the boundary, and that requires a good amount of emotional capacity on its own. But layering in someone trying to undermine your boundary requires a whole different level of presence. And with the laundry example, say you're the person who's been doing the other person's laundry for 50 years of marriage, but decide you aren't going to anymore. You need to know what crosses that boundary for you. Is asking you to show them how to use the washing machine an issue? What about them throwing in communal laundry items like sheets into your laundry to deal with? Now, what if they do it without asking? What if you find a pair of their socks in your laundry? What if it's half of their dirty clothes? No one else can tell you what feels like a violation of your boundaries. You may not mind that pair of socks, or that could make your blood boil. As I've said before, the better you know yourself, the better your conversations will go. And then what happens with this pushing against your boundary? How do you discuss it? Who is responsible for the work to undo how the boundary was crossed? How is that decided? Not all of this can be figured out ahead of time. Some of this will be in response to the situation as it unfolds. Learning how to stick with your new boundary, communicate it, and be flexible through the life that happens around it will make it much more likely to stick long term. If during this process it becomes clear that they are willing to repeatedly violate and push against your boundaries, then that's a pretty big red flag. That means that they can and will push against boundaries in all areas, not just this one new one, not just with this one new boundary, and it's not just this one area. It all boils down to this notion. Anytime we try to control someone or something other than ourselves, it is a boundary violation. Setting up our lives so that we don't do this to others is key. And setting a boundary with ourselves that we won't tolerate this behavior from others is a major factor in giving ourselves the lives we really want. This is an enormous challenge for those of us who have lived through ongoing abusive relationships. In those relationships, we learned how to people please as a survival skill. This is known as the fawn response to danger, as opposed to fight, flight, or freeze. We learn that the best way to stay safe is to pacify the other person's emotional dysregulation in order to maintain a steady baseline. This is exactly what my therapist was referring to when she said that I was doing it to myself. The belief that I had to dismiss my own needs in order to make someone else happy was so deep that I didn't even know it was my automatic response. And as we take the steps in our healing, we learn that we can take up space with our wants and our needs. This is what it means to hold true to our boundaries. And all of this impacts our attachment styles. Really, the way we attach to other people is a manifestation of our understanding of boundaries. If we are anxiously attached to others, we believe that we have to keep doing more to appease the other person and get in their good graces. If we are avoidant with other people, we implicitly believe that our needs won't be met, so we don't even give them a try to begin with. And if we have the disorganized style of attachment, which is at times either anxious or avoidant, we've learned that we can never be quite sure how other people will interact with us. And again, we can't change how people choose to interact with us. But we can set a baseline understanding for ourselves about what we need and what we want in order to feel safe and connect to other people. When we don't understand or act on our boundaries in a healthy way, we end up with our attachment styles being impacted. Another factor that's at play with boundaries has to do with the way we talk to ourselves and the expectations we have of what's acceptable. When we've been in long-term abusive relationships, we have to shut off from our intuition and instincts as a way of self-preservation, since the focus has to be on placating the person who's harming us in order to prevent further harm. Part of our work in healing is rewiring these mental models around what we tolerate from others. And this is why we so strongly recommend EMDR therapy. EMDR specifically helps us reprocess the old thought patterns into the new healthy ones we want to carry forward. But think about it. If we are trying to set boundaries around what we want, but our baseline understanding of what we want is built on an unstable foundation, what are the chances those boundaries are going to be solid? We often treat ourselves or say things to ourselves that would be deeply hurtful or even harmful if someone else said or did those things. Setting boundaries with ourselves around positive behaviors and thought patterns is key to changing how our relationships with others goes. And this is very much connected to something else we've discussed countless times in the LTS community. One of the primary ways that boundary crossing manifests if we've experienced trauma is through something called the Cartman Drama Triangle, also known as the trauma triangle. The premise for this concept is that when we are in unhealthy or harmful interactions with other people, we lose the connection to our true self and end up in one of three roles: the victim, the persecutor or abuser, and the rescuer or savior. The victim role cycles through the thought pattern of everything happens to me. We give away our autonomy to another person. We don't acknowledge our part in what's happening, like violating our own boundaries. This is a totally different concept than being a victim of a crime, which is a statement about life experiences. This is more about mindset. The persecutor or abuser role tries to control or manipulate the other person into doing what they think should be done or needs to be done. It is an attempt to strip someone else's autonomy from them. The rescuer or savior role attempts to protect the perceived victim from the perceived abuser. But this is also another version of stripping a person's autonomy from them, since we don't encourage the victim to hold onto their own boundaries. It is particularly common to see the rescuer role at play with supporters of our community at LTS. Of course, we want to see the people in our lives who are hurting heal and for their pain to dissipate. But only they can choose to do that for themselves. Crossing their boundaries by telling them what they have to do or signing them up for something you think is right for them actually causes more damage. One way this manifests is when I hear someone talking about their romantic partner with a description of, he's so patient. This is another way of saying he's in the rescuer role in our dynamic. It is saying that the person thinks they are too broken, damaged, take up too much space, etc. And the other person is the one who fixes that for them or should receive accolades for tolerating them. People in the rescuer role frequently using the person in the victim role as a way to avoid self-reflection and working on the parts of themselves that need healing. It is their own coping strategy, in fact. Part of healing is looking at how we give away our autonomy like this and put in clearer, healthier boundaries in place instead. A partnership is between two equals who both acknowledge their strengths and wounds and help each other leverage the strengths and heal the wounds. Here are some common phrases that indicate you might be in one of these drama triangle patterns in your relationships. So if you hear things like, they are so patient with me, or they're always making problems for me, or if I don't do it for them, they just aren't going to do it for themselves. If they would just see it my way, their lives would be so much better. I don't know how I would survive without them. Now, if any of these sound familiar, great. Look at you gaining insight into yourself. The next step is figuring out where you are crossing boundaries or allowing your boundaries to be crossed. And then put the boundaries in place that you need and want to be healthy. The goal here is to stay connected with your true self, your inner knowing, your intuition, and avoid falling into one of these roles. Living in these roles will never, ever, ever benefit you. Staying connected to your true self always benefits you. See, this is all connected to what my therapist was saying all those years ago. I violated my own boundaries so many times in different relationships I had. Romantic relationships, friendships, with family, with coworkers. For so long, I lived in a place of thinking that the best I could hope for was being tolerated. And the boundaries I had in place reflected that. Now, my work, your work, and our work is to undo the messages that get in the way of recognizing how we are violating our own boundaries. We learn what we want, and we set the structure in place to get those things. We don't try to control or to manipulate. We share a part of ourselves with others, and we respond to however they choose to interact with that information. The ironic thing about boundaries is that while it seems like they are restrictive and theoretically make things smaller, they actually bring freedom and expansion to your life. When you set boundaries to bring yourself the peace, the joy, the love that you want in your life, life feels so much more abundant. And as I've seen time and time again, as we get a taste of freedom, we are able to make even more decisions to bring more of that freedom to ourselves. It takes time and practice, of course. We do therapy, we restructure our lives, and set boundaries. But in doing these things, we are giving ourselves a precious gift that improves all aspects of our lives. So let's set a boundary and give yourself a good gift today. Thank you for listening to the Louder Than Silence podcast. If you'd like more information about our organization, visit us at louderthansilence.org and sign up for our newsletter. or follow us on Instagram at louderthansilence.org. If you like our work, please consider donating today. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for the most current episodes. We'll see you next month.